Hello, this is Dr. Shabour, and I'm going to give you a quick overview of the types of cells that you will encounter in biology. So, cells are really the smallest unit of life. If you remember when you see the progression of atoms into molecules, and you learn about atoms and how they kind of combine to create molecules, and molecules come together to make structures that are assembled into small little, compartments that are then part of a cell. Well, the cell is the smallest unit of life. That's where life starts. If you dismantle a cell structure, these individual pieces are not alive by themselves, but as together, all these structures together make up the cell, and the cell is the smallest unit of life. So, and then the cells assemble and they form tissues, and you'll learn about tissues in other chapters. So there are basic structural and functional unit for an organism, and that's the cell. And all cells share certain basic features. They all share a plasma membrane. There has to be a limit to the cell, and that's called the plasma membrane. So that's the surrounding part of a cell. And when you learned about macromolecules, and you heard about lipids, and more specifically phospholipids, you learned that phospholipids were the most abundant lipids in a membrane, and they basically make up the core of this membrane. So you have this very hydrophobic layer that's limiting the cell content from the external environment. All cells also contain a semi-fluid jelly-like cytosol inside. So the cell is not empty. The cell has liquid in it, and that's an aqueous environment. That means it's water-based. So most of it is water with solutes that are kind of dissolved in it. And we talk about the cytosol. So the cytosol is that liquid portion, the fluid portion. So it's not, it could be more jelly-like or more fluid-like. It depends on, the environment and the cell, but it's still a fluid. And we call it the cytosol. And when you have organelles that are going to be in it, and we have an entire chapter on organelles, so there will be more details about that in a separate chapter. Then we call that space the cytoplasm, which is the cytosol with all of the stuff in it, basically. All cells, no matter what kind of cells they are, and we're looking at the two types of cells in this chapter, we're talking about two types of cells, but all cells, what they share is they all contain chromosomes that are made of a molecule called DNA. The DNA and DNA, RNA, those are nucleic acids. So let me write this here. DNA and RNA are nucleic acids. And nucleic acids is that fourth category of those four macromolecules that you've seen in the past. So you might have spent more time on the first three, which are carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. The fourth type of macromolecule are nucleic acids. And nucleic acids are basically nucleotides, which is the monomer, and nucleotides are strung together to form nucleic acids. So just like amino acids are strung together to form a protein, nucleotides are strung together to form a nucleic acid. So we're not really getting into nucleic acids in this particular chapter, but it's a type of macromolecule, and we only have four types of macromolecules. So nucleic acids, like DNA, hold the genetic information that codes for everything that makes up the cell. So it's basically the code for making the cell. Also, in any cell, no matter what kind of cell it is, it has ribosomes. And ribosomes are very important for protein synthesis. So we're going to see ribosomes, and in the chapter of cell organelles, we'll talk about ribosomes there in a little bit more details. So these are, small molecules that are actually the combination of a couple of different molecules, protein and RNA, ribosomal proteins and RNA, and we end up with ribosomes when they're combined together. And these ribosomes are really important for actually making proteins. And proteins are made based on the genetic code in a DNA molecule. So all of that is actually going to be the subject of yet another chapter that we'll go over later. So here we're just introducing cells, and this is very important. This is typical test questions, and I lost my recording. Did I lose my recording? I lost power. No, I didn't lose my recording. Okay. Okay, so let's assume this is still recording. Okay, so let's look at the two types of cells. There are prokaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells, they're from bacteria and archaea domains. And I'm going to show you the 3 domains of life. Shouldn't I pause this and make sure that this is still recording? Because I'm not online anymore, right?
You're online.
I was still online this whole time?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I guess we'll see you at the end. Okay. So 3 domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Those are the 3 domains of life. Prokaryotic cells are cells from the bacteria and archaea domains. So these 2 domains, bacteria and archaea, all of these cells here, all of these cells, which we don't really, discuss in details, they are prokaryotic cells. So in a course like microbiology, that's all you'll be talking about, are these prokaryotic cells, because that's what bacteria are. They're, bacteria, this is what you discuss in microbiology, the different types of bacteria and viruses, but bacteria are prokaryotic cells. Eukarya include cells that are called eukaryotic cells. So prokaryotic cells cover these 2 domains. This is prokaryotic cells. And eukaryotic cells is what eukarya domain is made of. So our human cells, which is under animals, humans are right underneath here. So under animals, we would have humans, and those are the types of cells. The cells that make up our body are called eukaryotic cells. The cells that make up fungi are called eukaryotic cells. The cells that make up plants are called eukaryotic cells. So all these are eukaryotic cells. So they're a little bit more sophisticated cells with a really higher level of organization, and that's what we're going to see here. So if we're first look at bacteria, because this is kind of where we're starting, prokaryotic cells, they're from the bacteria and archaea domains. If we look at bacteria, they're really, truly the most diverse and widespread of the prokaryotes. This is really, basically, when we talk about prokaryotes, we're usually talking about bacteria. And bacteria come in different shapes. They come as little round balls called cocci, or sometimes you found certain bacteria that are more rod-like, right? So they're long little rods instead of balls, and those will be called bacilli. So bacillus is actually a rod-shaped bacterium. A coccus is a round-shaped bacterium, and spirilla are spiral-shaped bacteria. And so there will be, for example, syphilis is caused by a bacterium that is in the shape of a spirilla. And what's Lyme disease? Lyme disease is also caused by a bacterium that happens to have a spirilla shape to it. So they come in diverse forms, and diverse arrangements also. These are just different images. We're not really learning, the terminology of all of these different arrangements and these different shapes. This is just to show you that they really come in all of these different forms. Archaea, these types of cells, also prokaryotic cells, most of them live in very extreme environment. They can adapt to very extreme environment, such as very deep portions of the earth where the pressure is very high, the parts of the ocean, very, very hot places on the planet. You can still have life forms, and it would be from the domain of archaea because they're the only types of cells that can withstand extreme environments. So what are prokaryotic cells? So they're your most primitive cells. As I said earlier, eukaryotic cells is what animal cells are made of. Those are more sophisticated cells. So let's start with the more primitive cells, the prokaryotic cells. They lack membrane enclosed nucleus and other membrane enclosed organelles, which means that the cell, of course, the cell membrane is there because that's basic to all the cells. Remember one of my first slides over here, this slide, this is typical test question. All the following are part of any cell, prokaryote or eukaryote, except, so you'll have, choices of, a plasma membrane, yes. A chromosome, yes. Ribosomes, yes. A cytosol, yes. And then there'll be maybe a fifth answer, a nucleus, no. Prokaryotes do not have organelles, and a nucleus is a type of organelle. So organelles, and we'll see that in eukaryotes, organelles are basically little compartments that are inside the cell, and each compartment is responsible for doing something. But that's not the case in prokaryotic cells. We have no compartments within the cell. Everything is basically floating free in the cell. There's no mini compartments that something special is happening within that compartment within the bigger context of the cell. So they're very primitive. They're just a big sack of fluid with so that's the membrane is the edge of the cell. And what they have inside is a nucleoid, not a nucleus, it's a nucleoid, which is just an area where the DNA is going to be kind of like floating around. So I'm going to draw the DNA as a kind of circular like this. And maybe you're familiar with DNA molecules. They're helical. It's basically a helix like that. I'm sure you've seen the, even in emojis, you have a DNA emoji where you can see that DNA molecule. So the DNA molecule is basically free floating in a very specific part of the cell, and that region is called a nucleoid. It's just the area where the DNA is. So it's the area where the DNA is concentrated, and we call this nucleoid. So here in this particular diagram, it's all of this is the DNA, which is DNA plus proteins that are bound on the DNA form what we call the chromosome. So the chromosome is the genetic material that's made out of DNA and some proteins that are assembled together to kind of stabilize everything. Okay, so we have a nucleoid region where the DNA is floating. And then we also have free-floating ribosomes. This is something I mentioned in a previous slide. And some cells, not all, have, in addition to the plasma membrane, which is at the edge of the cell, see, this is the plasma membrane. You have additionally a cell wall, so that can be thick, and some bacteria have that, and that protects them. And some other bacteria have what we call a capsule on top of everything. There's an additional layer of protection. So usually bacteria with a capsule are usually more virulent, meaning they will be more pathogenic and harder for your body to destroy. So that's why they're more virulent. They make you sicker because of this protective capsule they have on them. But not all of them have that. That's why we don't list cell wall and capsule in 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 this list of all basic features, because they don't all have that. So when we say all cells have these basic features, that mean that every single cell has ribosomes, chromosomes, cytosol, and a plasma membrane. All right. Prokaryotes, what else? That's it. Nucleoid region and a plasma membrane and free ribosomes. All right. So here I'll box ribosomes. Nucleoid is circled. And what else did I want to box? Well, the plasma membrane, because that's standard. There we go. The cell wall is maybe yes on some cells, a capsule, yes on some cells, fimbria on some cells. Those are basically little ciliated extensions that help the cell kind of like wiggle around. And then flagella are really much longer, bigger extensions that help the cell move forward. But not all prokaryotic cells have that, so we just don't list them as standard for all prokaryotic cells. This is just a typical rod-shaped bacterium would have a flagellum, but they don't all do. So on the left, you have a diagram. On the right, you actually have a real picture taken with an electron microscope of what a bacillus would look like in an electron microscope. Pretty neat, huh? All right, the second type of cell is called eukaryotic cells. Those are the cells of the eukaryote domain. This is reminding you the eukaryote domain. And eukaryotic cells, they literally come in just so many different shapes. And this is just an example. These are examples of cells, eukaryotic cells in animal cells. So this is the lining of uterus, which is, you will be learning that someday. These are very long, tall cells, and they have a nucleus that's kind of at the bottom of the cell. Okay, and but in other types of organisms, the cells are going to be rounder. This is a round cell in yeast. So they're just different types of eukaryotic cells. In fungi, there's unicellular eukaryotes, animal cells, plant cells are also kind of long, but plant cells have an additional organelle in them that's really not present in animal cells. It's called a chloroplast, with pigments in them that can transform energy from sunlight into sugar. So this is very special to plants. Now, what eukaryotic cells have are these organelles. So we will talk about organelles in a separate chapter. Like I said, those are special compartments where something happens that's very specific to that compartment. So the nucleus right here happens to be one of these organelles that we will talk about, and that's where the DNA is stored. The mitochondrion is another example of an organelle that's found in these eukaryotic cells. And this is where ATP is going to be produced and released to be used somewhere else in the cell. That's the energy factory of the cell. This is where basically where gas is made, right? The gas you put in a car that provides the energy to move the car forward. That's what ATP is, and it's made in mitochondria inside the cell. So you see these different compartments inside the cell, they all have a very specific job. So here are some features of eukaryotic cells, which will be discussed in more details in a separate chapter called cell organelles. So, but what I've kind of alluded to is already the nucleus. Here's the nucleus, and this is a diagram I really like because it shows so many organelles in one beautiful diagram. So the nucleus here has a nuclear envelope, which is really just the cell, it's equivalent to the cell membrane, but it's the membrane around the nucleus. And by the way, all these compartments are membrane bound. That's kind of how the word is right here. It's membrane bound. There's a membrane that binds, that determines the edge of that organelle. That's the edge of the organelle. There's a membrane there. And it's the same composition of the cell membrane on the outer edge of the cell. So it's technically speaking the same kind of membrane, but it can have a different name. For example, in the nucleus, we call it the nuclear envelope, but it's really a membrane, just like the plasma membrane is a membrane. All right. We have the endoplasmic reticulum. That's another organelle. Like the nucleus is an organelle, endoplasmic reticulum is another organelle. And it comes here, it's all in blue here. It comes as rough or smooth, depending if there are ribosomes on the surface of it or no ribosomes on the surface of it. So this is a smooth ER, and the rough ER has all of these red dots on it. You see that? Okay, you see all these red dots over here? That's illustrating all the ribosomes. And some ribosomes are free floating, and some ribosomes are stuck on the ER and makes it look rough. Under the microscope, they literally saw that and they were like, oh, this is very granular. Oh, looks rough. Let's call it rough ER. Oh, I see here, there's another portion of that endoplasmic reticulum, but there's no granulation on it. It looks much smoother. Let's call this smooth ER. And all this was even before we understood what smooth ER and rough ER did, which I'll discuss in that separate chapter. Here is a mitochondrion. There's one mitochondrion, and mitochondria is the plural. So that's another example of organelle. And like I mentioned in the previous slide, this is where ATP production is going to take place. And anyway, there's other organelles, and we'll just get into more details about these in a separate chapter. So this is just to give you an overview of prokaryotic cells versus eukaryotic cells. They're very different. As you can see, eukaryotic cells have a lot of special things in them. Basically, those are like mini compartments within the cell where there is a specific function taking place in every single one of these compartments. So cells, they must maintain an adequate surface area to volume ratio because they really can't function adequately if they are too small or too large, and they really stay in a very specific range of size. I don't think I'm going to get into more details about that as far as this slide is concerned. I'm just going to leave it at that. And I probably delete this slide in future presentations. Anyway, this is just an introduction to prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Thank you for paying attention.